Back to you, Peter.
Ingrid, okay, so since the budget, consumer confidence has been rocked, as Ingrid pointed out, which is bound to rock the retail sector, which has been positive and a really good story for 11 months in a row. But could the budget also pummel the property sector, which has been another good news story for the economy? Charles Tarbey is the founder of Century 21 Australia and New Zealand, Charles?
Yes, sir.
And Fiji?
And Papua New Guinea.
And Papua New Guinea. He joins me now in the studio, mate. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Peter.
And that's true. Retail and housing have been a really good story, while the investment in the mining sector is coming off the boil. We're still selling plenty of mining exports, but your sector and the retail sector have been doing really well. Has the budget hurt the property sector, or was it already a bit spooked?
Look, it was already spooked, and we were noticing the change going on all the way back in January. People were still talking boom and massive over-reserve prices.
Yeah.
It was very clear that that was only in certain pockets, and the rest of the country was actually correcting, and corrected. In most places, had already corrected. So clearance rates dropped into the 60s on an average right across the country, and have been like that for the last 8 or 9 weeks.
Yeah.
So people were still talking 8 or 9 weeks ago about the market booming, but it already stopped.
So what you're saying then is the boom or the bubble talk was primarily Sydney?
It was primarily certain suburbs of Sydney and certain suburbs of other capital cities. It wasn't the entire area. And again, boom time is when we hit the 80s all of the time in clearance rates. We did that once this year, once. Yeah. But if you read the newspapers, you would think it was happening every week.
Okay, so looking at the housing sector then, apart from some suburbs in Sydney, you're saying that we're fairly at what, low growth levels?
Yeah, the correction came through 3 ways. Firstly, sellers started to see prices of properties jumping higher than what they thought their property was worth. So they were coming in the market at a higher price, and that's what we've had now. So we're in a negotiator's market. So we've got sellers coming in at a high price. That was the first thing that impacted straight away. The second thing was that the banks started to get a little bit concerned, and as you know, in New Zealand they slapped a completely different lending ratio for first-home buyers, and that slowed that market down. So the banks started to talk, and then all of a sudden you've got the valuers who now have to try and keep up with pricing. So if the valuers are starting to get nervous about pricing, they're going to value properties lower than contract price, and that's going to hold it off for some time. So those 3 things have started to happen.
What about the talk that interest rates could be these levels for a lot longer? Because I would say, you would recall at the beginning of the year, most of the economists were saying a rise sometime this year, probably around November or something like that. Yeah. If it starts sinking in, Charles, that interest rates could be, and like Saul Eslake this week said, he doesn't see a rise until 2016. What would that do to the housing sector?
Look, Peter, there was an influx of buyers, a massive influx of buyers that were sitting on the fence. The last time I spoke to you about this, we talked about the bubble, and I mentioned to you that what I'm seeing right now, or back then, were people were sitting on the fence. 1 or 2 things would happen. Either the fence would fall over, which is a boom, or people would start creeping off and starting to buy. Well, there was an overload of buyers. So that all happened in the last 6 months. Those overload came in, kicked in, bought, and now you've got steady buyers who are sitting back. And we expect that. So I don't really think there's going to be a massive change other than mild growth, particularly in Brisbane. I think Brisbane will have the best growth of all capital cities this year, but I think that Sydney will sit under 10% in growth, whereas a lot of the pundits are predicting over 10%. I just don't think it's going to be there.
We'll come back to Brisbane in a second, because fortunately I've been saying that Brisbane looked like a good market if you're going to buy, but I think the more important question is, and I know when Macquarie has looked at the stock market and the economy, they've used the analogy of slow grind higher. Could the property market be in the same sort of situation if that kind of negativity we're seeing around now is only being offset by the fact that interest rates don't rise?
Yeah, I think so. The negativity we're seeing around now is really good for the real estate market. A lot of people think it's not. I think it's a great thing, because the worst thing that we could have right now is massive growth. Massive growth means that there's going to be a problem down the end. And we talked about the bubble, and I think our good friend came out again recently from the US and talked about the bubble burst. This is the fourth or fifth year in a row I think it's going to burst.
Is that Harry, or is it...
I think
or is it Grantham?
I think it's Mr. Dent.
Okay, Harry Dent.
We did speak about both of them.
Both of
One
them,
them
yeah.
was still walking to Canberra, wasn't he?
that's
Oh, no, who was that? That was
Steve,
still walking to Canberra.
Yeah, that was Steve Keane. Yeah.
So there's
Canberra to Kosciuszko.
three of them in there. So I actually think that there was a massive correction taking place in the last quarter of last calendar year and the first quarter of this calendar year, and that correction has now occurred, and we're now back into a balanced marketplace where people can go out and confidently look at property, make an offer without having to rush in. And you're seeing it, Peter, because you're seeing properties are going up for auction and being sold before auction now.
Yeah. And I'm also starting to see in the expensive areas that were doing really well, auctions are now going to for sales. So that means that they've overpriced, the market won't meet it, and now it's negotiation.
And the banks, all of them, they're just saying, no, that's enough's enough. Let's get back to reality.
Okay, let's go to the Brisbane one, because I always like giving tips to my viewers. Why do you like Brisbane?
Well, I look at the prices and the cycles, and every week I've been keeping prices and
how many outlets do you have around the country?
Around 300 offices.
Yeah, so it's a good footprint.
And they all operate in real time.
Yeah.
So I can see every office's performance as it's happening, rather than historical data. We see it right now.
Yeah.
And the reality is simply this: the cycle that occurred last time was, and why I'm keen on Brisbane, is that Sydney and Brisbane got very, very close to median price to each other, going back a couple of years ago. And traditionally there's always been a substantial gap between the two, and you would be able to sell in Sydney and move to Brisbane, and you would get a great lifestyle and some extra cash.
Yeah, arbitrage.
That cycle has now occurred again. We're back there now. And so people are starting to look at their asset in Sydney, Melbourne, and say, hey, maybe it's that time. And I think that will give Queensland and Brisbane, and particularly the areas, the coastal areas that suffered significantly, a great upswing in price.
So you're saying it's going to be a better time for Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast. Yeah, and it partly explains why Bank of Queensland's been doing a lot better as well, because they're exposed to the real estate market there as well. Now, but also, Charles, as a businessman, how do you think this economy is going to go? You felt the budget reaction. Do you think this could go off the boil eventually, and the real things like low interest rates, the fact that people are finding jobs, will eventually kick in?
And if I look at it from a business point of view, as you mentioned, and the gut feel of what I've had to go through in the last 3 years in business, I would say we're in a pretty strong place where there's opportunity. You're going to have to work for it, but if I go back 2 years ago, it was horrible. Even a year ago, it was horrible. The banks are talking very differently now, and they're a lot more positive than they were, so I'm okay with it. I think we're going to be
So you're optimistic, but you're not going over the top.
Absolutely not.
But you're miles better than 2 years ago.
Miles better.
Charles, thanks for joining us on the program.